Hey guys, so we are in your book, you're on page 312, and this is section 3 of unit 4, and we're going to talk about the baby beginnings, the birth of democracy in Athens. So, Greece, which wasn't the country Greece, it was just a whole bunch of individual little city-states where they all happened to speak the same language, which was Greek. Well, one of those city-states was called Athens. Athens, Greece. And let's see, I've got to give you a little vocabulary first. This is all over the Greek lands. Most of them were tyrannies. A tyranny is where there's one ruler that makes all the rules. They don't listen to anybody else. They don't care what anybody else says. They are the ruler. Now, the word tyranny, or really the word tyrant, usually has a negative connotation. Connotation is like the feeling you get when you hear a word. If you just hearing the word or reading the word, if you have a feeling, something makes you happy. Birthday usually makes us happy. Tyrant usually makes us sad. Tyrant is kind of a negative word. It's got a negative connotation to it. All tyrants were not negative. Some tyrants were kind of okay, but they still didn't listen to anyone else. They made all their own rules. But lots of tyrants were real jerks. Okay, so most city-states in the Greek-speaking lands were tyrants. Some of them were aristocracies or oligarchy. Aristocracy and oligarchy are the same thing. This means rule by the rich. You can, oh, I forgot a C in there, aristocracy. You can say aristocracy because the rich people were the aristocrats. That's what they were called. The rich people in society were called aristocrats. And so an aristocracy is a community that is led by the aristocrats. But you can also call an aristocracy an oligarchy. An oligarchy means rule by the rich. So if you hear aristocracy or oligarchy, they can be interchangeable. But we still today in 2020, there are oligarchies. There are countries that are just led by the rich. So that's an oligarchy. But we don't necessarily call them an aristocracy because when we say the word aristocrat, we're usually talking about history. So if you're talking about something that happened a really long time ago, you can say the word aristocrat. We don't usually use those words for modern times. We just call them the rich or the upper class or whatever. But if you say aristocracy or oligarchy, they can be interchangeable. But things started to change a little bit. Let me clear this, and you'll have to bear with me. I'm using a different whiteboard and it's a little weird to get used to. I'm going to draw my little timeline. So here's us in 2020 CE. So let's go the opposite of us, 2020 BCE. So it's 4,000 years ago. So if this is 2020, let's say this is about 1,000 BCE. So about, I think this would be about the middle. So if this is the middle, if this is 500, I'm going to go a little further back to about 600. So 594 BCE. At this time in Athens, this guy, Solon, was the leader of the Athenian polis. And he did something that was kind of interesting. He ended debtor's prison. I mean, not debtor's prison, debtor's slavery. What is debtor's slavery, Mrs. Givens? Well, a debt, hopefully you know what a debt is, but a debt is when you owe someone money. If you borrow money, if one of you says, hey, can I borrow 1,000 tenge to a friend of yours, and that friend says, sure, and gives you the money, now you are in debt. You owe that person money. Well, in ancient Greece, if you borrowed money from someone, but you couldn't pay it back, they could sell you into slavery. You could become a slave because you borrowed money and couldn't pay it back or didn't pay it back. So that's a debtor. You are a debtor if you owe money. And if you owe money and you don't pay it back, you can become a slave. Well, Solon ended that. No more debtor's slavery. He said, just because you can't afford to pay back some money that you borrowed doesn't mean you should become a slave. So that was big. And he also allowed some non-aristocratic citizens to vote. That was pretty cool, huh? Like, he's saying not only rich people are going to make all the decisions. Now, he had a very strict set of rules of who these people, who these citizens were that could go in and vote. But still, it was, at least he let some people that weren't just the rich rulers of the city-state go in and vote. That was a big deal. So then in 508, so let's see, if this was about 600, if this is 1,000 and this is 0 and this is 600, then I'm going to go with this is 500. So I'm going to put it down here. So in 508 BCE is a ruler named, let me, bear with me while I erase all this so I can start writing about a different person. Okay, about 508 is this guy, Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes. He did even more for the people. We're not talking about the rich people, we're talking about everyone else. He took away some of the powers. He reduced powers of the rich. And he allowed even more of the lower classes to vote. Lower classes to vote. And he increased the power of the assembly. The assembly was the group of citizens that got together to talk about the laws and help make laws and change laws. So it was this group that they met, and they didn't necessarily have all that much power before. They just got together and talked. And Cleisthenes made it so that they had more power over the actual laws of Athens. He allowed more lower classes to vote, and he took some of the power away from the aristocrats. Now, let me erase that. Now, in 461, okay, if this is 600 and this is 508, then I'm gonna say, let's put 461 here. In 461 BCE, citizen juries began. What? That's so cool. What is a jury? You should know what a jury is. Hopefully you know what a jury is. If you, I don't know, a teacher says you stole something, then a teacher says you stole something and you say, I didn't steal anything, then a jury of your peers would get together and the teacher would say what the teacher thought and you say what you think, and some people from your school, your jury, listens to you and listens to the teacher, and then the jury decides if you are innocent or guilty. That's what a jury is. And in 461, juries began in Athens. Before, if somebody said, that guy stole from me, that guy was probably put to death. And now, if someone says, that guy stole from me, then the accuser and the accused have to stand before this jury. And they both give their stories of what happened. And the jury decides who's innocent, who's guilty, and what happens. Now, just a little bit later, in the 450s BCE, in the 450s, Pericles started paying people to be on this jury, paying jurors. A person that sits on a jury is a juror, paying jurors and paying people to just participate in civic duties. Civic duties is something that you do as a citizen to have something to do with the government, like people that sit at the assembly, people that can do this stuff are doing their civic duty. And why does that matter? Why does it matter to pay a juror? Well, because even though a poor person has the right to serve on a jury, a poor person couldn't do it anyway because they can't afford to not work. They have to work so they can feed their children. They're like, sure, I'd love to serve jury duty, but I can't because I have to work. So if the jury, if they get paid to sit on a jury, then they can do it. And if they get paid to be a member of the assembly, then they can do it. Before, it was exclusive. Like, sure, it was officially open to everyone. Oh yeah, poor people can be on the assembly. We welcome everyone as a member of the assembly. But that was only in words, because the only people that could actually serve on the assembly were the rich people that didn't need the money anyway. So now Pericles started paying people to be on the jury and paying people to fulfill civic duties. And now it really was open to any citizen, not really anyone, but any citizen could do these things because they didn't have to worry about feeding their children. They could do it and get paid. That was a really big thing. And another thing that was a pretty big deal at this time in Athens was the simple idea of citizenship. Before these times, people were not considered citizens, people were subjects. And honestly, a subject was kind of like a pet. There were the rulers, there was the king or the queen, the tyrant, and maybe the aristocracy. Those were the ones that like really mattered. And then everyone else was kind of their pet. They didn't have any rights of their own. They were just workers for the aristocracy. These people, the people underneath us, they only exist so I can live. These people beneath us, they sew my clothes, they grow my food, they teach my children. They were kind of, I mean, really a pet is the best way to describe it. Pets that did things, maybe not pets, maybe working animals, like animals that do the work. But now, suddenly, this idea of citizenship has appeared, where human beings have rights. And so you had to be a citizen, and we already talked about that before, who was a citizen and who wasn't a citizen. But if you were a citizen, you actually had rights to help make a decision about what happens in your city-state. And this was huge. The idea of citizenship was big. So another thing that began happening in Athens at this time was education. I know some of you are like, education, whatever. But imagine if you never went to school a day in your life. Sounds like fun. I know it sounds like a holiday, but think about these past 8 months when you were officially in school over the internet, but you're happy to be back in school. Well, what if you didn't even have the internet and you never went to school a day in your life? You don't know how to read, you don't know how to write, you don't know anything about mathematics, no schooling, no education at all. Well, this is the time in Athens when boys began being educated. They made schools, just like the one you're going to, and boys went to school. And in the beginning, school was very, very basic. Simple reading, writing, math, that was it. But eventually, they even began higher education. Higher education really is what you guys are getting right now. Lower education stops when you're about 10 or 11. Most kids only went to school until they were about 10 or 11. But Athens began higher education, and there were these professional lecturers that would travel around Greek lands and would speak and give lectures just like I'm giving you a lecture right now and I'm teaching you. They did that. It would be like if my job were to just travel and I went to different schools around the world to teach students what I know. So Athens had those. That was, sorry, I've almost forgotten about my timeline. 450, let's say here, that was the 420s. And the 420s is when education for boys began. All right, now I'm going to erase all of this, finished with my timeline. So these are some important parts of Athenian government. Athenian, that means from Athens, Athenian. There was the assembly. At the assembly, all free adult male citizens, I don't really have to say male citizens because females weren't citizens. So all free adult citizens were free to attend the assembly. The assembly met 40 times a year. And here's a cool thing. Everyone was allowed to speak. They didn't have to, but they could if they wanted to. A rich aristocrat had just as much equality to speak at an assembly as a poor farmer. And that's a big deal because remember, most city-states in the area were led by either tyrants or the aristocrats. And a poor farmer no one would care what a poor farmer had to say. But in Athens, the poor farmer could stand up and speak and say what he thought the rules should be like, what he thinks the laws should be. And everyone would listen to the poor farmer at the same way that they would listen to the rich man in his fancy clothes. That's the assembly, and that's an important one to remember. And then there was the assembly, and then there was the council. The council was made up of 500 people that decided what would be discussed at the assembly. So these 500 people got together and they talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and decided what it was that was going to be brought forth in front of the assembly. And the council was also known as a boule. So council, boule. Now, there were the courts. And this is really cool because just like I said, most city-states were run by tyrants or the aristocracy. And if someone said, that guy stole from me, then it was either some rich dude or the tyrant that decided what happened. But instead, in Athens, they had courts with juries, and the jury decided. So the important parts of the Athenian government were the assembly, the council, and the courts. And let's see here. Athens was a limited democracy. It's a limited democracy because everyone that lived in Athens did not have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to vote because who did have the right to vote? Men that were free. Foreigners were not allowed to vote. Slaves were not allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to vote. So it was a limited democracy. But it was also a direct democracy. A direct democracy means that every citizen directly votes. If every citizen that's there at the assembly has the right to vote and does vote. If 2,000 people show up for the assembly, then 2,000 people vote. And that's different than a representative democracy. Representative democracy. A representative democracy is what's in the United States right now. We talked about that when I talked about the elections, and I told you guys how the Electoral College works. Remember, there's the executive branch and the judicial branch and the legislative branch of the US government. This is the president, and this is the Supreme Court. And then this is your senators and representatives. Remember how I said every state has 2 senators, and then each state is broken down into smaller parts, and each one of those small parts gets 1 representative. And then I vote for my representative, and I vote for my senator. But then when it comes down to who makes the actual laws, these people make the laws. 2,000, if I live in a city of 2,000 people, 2,000 people don't vote on the laws. These senators and representatives, they vote on the laws. So the United States is a representative democracy because every single citizen doesn't vote on the laws. The citizen votes for the representative, and then the representative votes for the law. It didn't work that way in Athens. In Athens, it was a direct democracy. Direct democracy. The citizens themselves voted for the laws. So that's the difference. You need to know the difference in a direct democracy and a representative democracy. And we are finished with section 3. Bye, guys. I'll see you soon.